Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's program. And this week we're continuing our ongoing session entitled The Apportionment Black Belt. And this week we're in session 4. So before we get into today's material, let's just briefly review some of the topics that we've discussed so far. We started this program talking about the new apportionment regime under Senate Bill 899, which passed in 2004, and we reviewed in great detail, almost on a word-by-word basis, new Labor Code 4663 and Labor Code 4664, and we dissected those labor codes with a fine-tooth comb to unearth the meanings of each of the words contained within those codes. Then we began our discussion on apportionment by talking about some of the common themes and common scenarios that you will encounter in your evaluations. And we began by talking about how to handle apportionment in an examinee who has had a prior industrial injury that settled by way of compromise and release. And you're going to encounter these types of examinees, so you need to know how to handle it. And we said that a compromise and release is not exactly the same as a formal award of permanent disability. However, a compromise and release may have several things in common with a formal award of permanent disability. And depending upon your opinion, you can handle a compromise release either the same as you would handle an examinee who did indeed have a prior award of permanent disability, so you can handle it the same, or you can handle it differently if the circumstances compel you to do such. So you have some option there as to how you handle the apportionment. In our next session, we talked about how to handle those examinees who do indeed have an award of permanent disability. And both of these two scenarios, the compromise and release and the prior award of permanent disability, represent scenarios where injured workers have had prior industrial injuries. And it's interesting because Labor Codes 4663 and 4664 are very much concerned that we properly handle examinees who have had prior industrial injuries. Recall that the new apportionment regime had an overriding purpose, and that was to help control and reduce skyrocketing costs in the handling of workers' compensation claims. One of the ways that Senate Bill 899 handles skyrocketing costs is by creating tighter and more stringent controls on apportionment of the permanent impairment. And the legislature that drafted and passed Senate Bill 899 at the time was very concerned that we take a strong and hard look at examinees who did indeed have a prior industrial injury. And the law now allows us to apportion to prior industrial injuries, even in those cases where there has not been a settlement by way of compromise release and there has not been a prior award of permanent disability. So we can apportion to prior industrial injuries, even when as I said, there's no prior compromise and release and there is no prior award of permanent disability. But our first two sessions, we focused on those examinees who had received monetary compensation for their prior industrial injury, either through a compromise and release or through an award of permanent disability. And we said that according to Labor Code 4664, if the examinee has had a prior award of permanent disability, the permanent disability is conclusively presumed to be permanent. It's interesting. Sometimes we forget what the word permanent means. Permanent means permanent. Well, the permanency of the disability was solidified and set into stone with the passage of Labor Code 4664. It says if the examinee had a prior award of permanent disability, then that disability exists into perpetuity. What is it about the disability that persists? Well, certainly the percentage and the monetary award of the disability persists. The pain associated with the prior permanent disability exists into perpetuity. In other words, we assume according to law that these examinees will have ongoing pain consistent with their permanent disability forever. They'll have pain forever. So we're not to be surprised when the examinee tells us at our evaluation for a subsequent injury, when they tell us that they have pain, we should not be surprised because the law tells us that their pain associated with the prior permanent disability exists forever. What else exists forever? Their limitations and activities of daily living persist forever. So when they come to us for our evaluation on a subsequent injury, and they tell us that they can't do this and they can't do that, and they have limitations to activities of daily living, we should not be surprised because the law tells us that the disability persists, exists forever. Subjective complaints exist and persist forever. Positive objective findings associated with the disability exist and persist forever. Any work restrictions that the examinee may have had imposed upon them associated with the prior disability exist and persist forever. Well, that's all well and good, and it creates a whole new can of worms because the second sentence of Labor Code 4664 tells us that this presumption, meaning the presumption that the permanent disability exists and persists forever, is a presumption affecting the burden of proof. We talked about great length about that second sentence, and we concluded that that second sentence simply means that the defendant has the burden of proof of proving two things. And now we're talking about the defense attorney and or the insurance company and or the employer. Those all can be renamed as the defendant. The defendant has the burden of proving two things. Number one, that the examinee did indeed receive a prior award of permanent disability. So the defendant has to dig up that information in those prior records. Now the examinee is required to disclose this upon request, but it's the defendant's job and it's their burden to dig up this information and bring it to light so that it becomes known to the parties for our evaluation, and it becomes known to the parties in relation to the subsequent injury. Okay, so they have the burden of proving the existence of a prior award. And then number two, the defendant has the burden of proving overlap of the current disability with the prior disability. So in cases where the examinee had an injury to the same body part, let's say the lumbar spine, and they received a prior award of permanent disability, and now they've had a subsequent injury, and we as evaluators determine that indeed they have impairment of the same body part, say the lumbar spine, well, we have two disabilities. Well, if those disabilities overlap in terms of pain distribution, in terms of objective findings, in terms of limitations and activities of daily living, in terms of the descriptions that we use to describe the permanent impairment, if those disabilities overlap, then the amount of the overlap here can be apportioned out, and it's the defendant's burden to prove the overlap. So it's not your burden as the doctor. You can simply provide your permanent impairment description and your apportionment argument, but don't be surprised when the defendant comes back to you and asks you by way of supplemental report or in deposition to discover or describe or to answer questions regarding any potential overlap of the two disabilities. So the defendant is going to be motivated to prove overlap. So that's something that you need to be aware of even in preparing your report on examinees who have had a prior award of permanent disability. And we reviewed several cases such as the Minivilli case, the Carreras case, the Papish case, where the defendant was unable to establish and prove overlap. So in cases where the defendant is unable to prove overlap, the examinee simply receives the entirety of the permanent disability award unapportioned. And there may be situations where the defendant doesn't even make an effort to establish overlap because for whatever reason they believe that overlap cannot be established. And the most common scenario where that occurs are those cases that involve the 2005 permanent disability rating schedule under the AMA guides and a prior injury that involved permanent disability under the 1997 permanent disability rating schedule. That would be one example where the defendant could possibly think that overlap cannot be established due to the different standards that are used with both systems. Okay? So that's not to say that overlap cannot be established. I can imagine several scenarios where the examinee has had a prior award under the 1997 schedule and now has a new impairment under the AMA guides. I can see several scenarios where overlap between the two disabilities could very reasonably be established. But you may encounter scenarios where the defendant just simply drops the issue and allows the examinee to receive the entire new award unapportioned. So you need to be aware of that going into your evaluation with these types of injured workers. Now for today's discussion, I want to continue with a couple more of the common scenarios that you're going to encounter when it comes to your apportionment determination. And I want to reiterate something that I said all the way back in session 1 of this program. And I said that apportionment is actually very simple. Doctors seem to find apportionment more difficult than it actually is. And the reason for that is they fail to identify the finite number of recurring themes that occur over and over and over again in the apportionment determination. As I said, there's only about 5 to 6 to 7, maybe as many as 8 recurring themes that you're going to see over and over and over again. And so once you master these 6 or 8 recurring themes, you're going to have the apportionment determination basically whipped. It's just simply a matter of inputting the specific details of your examinee into the recurring scenario and coming up with your final conclusion. Well, 2 of those scenarios we've already discussed, and that is the examinees who have had prior industrial injuries that settle by compromise and release. You're going to see that all the time. I see those cases all the time. And examinees who have received a prior award of permanent disability. We see these all the time. These involve the examinees who have multiple and repeat industrial injuries. Examinees who, for whatever reason, seem to have multiple industrial injuries. So we handled those scenarios and those circumstances. Well, today I want to talk to you about 2 more of the common circumstances that you're going to see. And that has to deal with, number 1, the growing number of examinees that we're seeing that are presenting to us with a claim for 2 industrial injuries. The first one is a specific injury on a specific date, and the second injury involves a period of cumulative trauma, usually that ends with the date of the specific injury. So for example, we'll see an examinee who's claiming a and elevates it to the point that it requires medical care. So these are situations that we're going to encounter all the time. So if we can simply master these 2 situations, we'll be well on our way to receiving our black belt in apportionment. So I want you to retrieve the 2 cases that I've sent to you in today's materials. That is the Benson case. That's going to be illustrative of our number 1 scenario, the specific and cumulative trauma injury at the same time. And then also the Vaira case, V-A-I-R-A case. That is representative of the types of cases where the examinee has a pre-existing, although asymptomatic condition, and who later and subsequently suffers an industrial injury. So go ahead and retrieve those cases. Those are going to be our course materials for today. And I look forward to being right back with you here in just a minute as we continue our new series on apportionment. And today we're talking about specific and cumulative trauma simultaneous injuries and examinees with pre-existing asymptomatic conditions. So I look forward to being back with you here in just a couple moments. Okay, I'm back with you now, and I have my Benson case and my Viara case, and I hope you have those with you as well. I think it's important that as we go through these cases, you put your own eyes on these materials and you see for yourself these points that emerge from these cases. So let's begin with the Benson case. Now, important principle of the Benson case is that the Benson case involved a simultaneous claim for a specific injury. In this case, it was to the cervical spine, and then also a period of cumulative trauma injury ending on the date of the specific injury, also a claim for injury to the cervical spine. So we have a simultaneous claim for two simultaneous injuries, a specific injury claim and a cumulative trauma injury claim. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm seeing this almost in every single case, especially those cases that are represented. I should say those cases that involve represented injured workers. The applicant attorney is filing a claim for a specific injury and also a period of cumulative trauma. So how is this and why is this? Well, it's important that we understand the Benson case and the subtle nuances of handling the apportionment of the Benson case and Benson-like cases. So I want to share with you some of the internal strategy involved with filing these claims for simultaneous, specific, and cumulative trauma injuries. So with regards to Benson, Benson suffered two injuries to the neck. And so the Benson case is illustrative of how to handle apportionment of two injuries to the same body part with the same employer that become permanent and stationary at the same time. Now, prior to the passage of Senate Bill 899 and the adoption of Labor Codes 4663 and 4664, and under the Wilkinson Doctrine, these types of cases used to be entitled to receive a single combined award for the two injuries. In other words, the examinee suffered a specific injury, they suffered a cumulative trauma injury, they go through the qualified medical evaluation, and the medical evaluator provides for a permanent impairment rating, or used to be a permanent disability rating, and the examinee would receive a single combined award for the entirety of the permanent disability. Okay, you follow? Well, when Labor Code 4663 and 4664 were passed, our causation regime was transformed into a causation regime. So in today's scenario, with an examinee who has a specific injury and has a cumulative trauma injury that both become permanent and stationary at the same time, each of those injuries contribute to the permanent impairment. Each of those injuries then need to be described in the apportionment determination. Okay? Prior, both of those injuries provided for permanent impairment in a combined fashion, but now we're required to apportion based on causation and the amount of contribution of injury A and the amount of contribution of injury B to the permanent impairment. So now, under our new regime, the examinee is no longer entitled to receive a single combined award of permanent disability. Rather, they receive two separate but smaller awards of permanent disability. So what's important about that, and what impact does that have? Well, because of the non-linearity of the benefit schedule, two single small awards reimburse the examinee at a much lower rate than a single combined award for the same permanent disability. So in the case of Benson, Benson suffered two injuries to the neck. The first was a specific injury on 6/3/2003, and the second was a cumulative trauma injury through 6/3/2003. She ultimately required a 3-level fusion of the cervical spine. So this was a bona fide condition, and it was a serious condition of the cervical spine. Well, she was determined to have 62% permanent disability, with 50% of the disability due to the specific injury and 50% due to the cumulative trauma injury. So the qualified medical evaluator in this case, he identified two injuries. He identified a specific injury and he identified a cumulative trauma injury. It's interesting because prior to the qualified medical evaluation, the examinee was not claiming a cumulative trauma injury, but based upon his finding of two injuries, the examinee then went on to file a claim for the cumulative portion, or the cumulative trauma portion, for the cumulative trauma injury. Okay? So 62% permanent disability, 50% due to the specific injury, 50% due to the cumulative trauma injury. So of the 62% permanent disability, 31%, half, 50%, was due to the specific, 31% was due to the cumulative trauma. Well, according to the benefit schedule, this resulted in a total award of $49,210 in benefits from the two separate awards, each of which were payable at a rate of $185 per week for 133 weeks. So she received $370 for 133 weeks. $185 from injury A, $185 from injury B, for a total of $49,000. Okay? Well, under the Wilkinson doctrine, under a single combined award rather than two smaller awards, the award would have been much higher. And so under the Wilkinson doctrine, Benson argued for a single combined permanent disability of $67,000. Okay? Two separate awards of 31% each combined to total $49,000. A single combined award of 62% permanent disability, the same level of permanent disability, qualified for $67,000, $18,000 more for the combined award compared to the two smaller separate awards. Okay? The permanent disability is the same. It's both 62%. With a single combined award, 62% reimburses at $67,000. With two separate injuries, two awards of 31% each, totaling 62%, only compensate at 49%. 67, 49. The difference is due to the non-linearity of the benefit schedule, which more handsomely rewards the more and more severe disabilities, like a 62% disability. That's severe. Okay? So Benson argued for a single combined award for $67,000. This was payable at $185 per week for 362 weeks. The other was payable for 133 weeks. This one was payable for 362 weeks, more than twice the time. More than twice the time. Well, under Labor Code 4664, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board opined and ruled that the Wilkinson doctrine was inconsistent with Labor Code 4664 and our requirement for apportionment based on causation. And they arrived at this decision very quickly. It did not take them long to arrive at it, because it's very clear that in cases that involve two separate injuries, our job is to apportion the percentage of impairment due to injury A and the percentage impairment due to injury B. Now, in these types of cases, it just so happens that these two injuries are with the same employer and to the same body part. We may have scenarios where the examinee has a prior award and a new award, and we simply apportion that one out. But in this case, where two injuries become permanent and stationary at the same time, they both qualify for benefits. Well, we're required to determine how much benefits each one qualify for. We're required to apportion based on causation. What is the cause of the permanent disability? Certain percentages due to injury A, certain percentages due to injury B, and this results in a finding of two separate, although smaller, awards than a combined award. Now, the reason that we're seeing an increase in this type of scenario, simultaneous, specific, and cumulative trauma injuries, because under certain limited circumstances, it may be not possible for the qualified medical evaluator to determine how much is due to injury A and how much is due to injury B. In other words, it may not be possible to parcel out the contribution from each of the industrial injuries. Well, if it's not possible to parcel them out and to say specifically that injury A caused 10% and injury B caused 20%, what happens if we're not able to parcel them out? If we're not able to parcel them out, then the examinee is entitled to a single combined award. They're entitled to receive the single larger award, which compensates much, much higher. So when we have these cases, you can bet that your apportionment determination is going to be scrutinized in great detail by both the applicant attorney and the defense attorney. The applicant attorney is going to argue for a single combined award. The defense attorney is going to argue for two smaller awards. And the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board stated that a single award, even though Labor Code 4662 requires that we apportion to each injury, the Appeals Board said that a single award may still be appropriate in certain circumstances. And that's what the applicant attorney is hoping for, that some of those circumstances are present with your examinee. They said, we observe, however, that there may be limited circumstances where the evaluating physicians cannot parcel out within reasonable medical probability the approximate percentages to which each successive injury causally contributed to the employee's overall permanent disability. So the evaluator, within reasonable medical probability, cannot parcel out the contribution of each injury. Under these limited circumstances, a combined award of permanent disability may still be justified. In such an instance, the physician's apportionment determination within the meaning of Labor Code 4663 could properly be that the approximate percentages of disability caused by each of the successive injuries cannot reasonably be determined. And that's a key phrase. This could be your conclusion, that I'm not able, within reasonable medical probability, to conclude the percentage caused by each injury. I simply can't do it. In some cases, how can you do it without speculating? You can't. Okay? As a result, the employee would be entitled to an undivided award for the combined permanent disability because the respective defendants would have failed in their burdens of proof on the issue of apportionment. And remember, we said that the burden of proof is on the defendant. because apportionment benefits the defendant. Remember, the defendant has two burdens: to establish the presence of a prior award of permanent disability, to establish any overlap between successive disabilities, and in this case, on the Benson case, the burden of proof is on the defendant to prove the percentage of permanent impairment caused by injury A and the percentage of permanent impairment caused by injury B, so that the examinee ends up with two smaller awards rather than one combined award. If the defendant fails on their burden of proof, the examinee or the applicant is then left with a single combined award, which is much, much greater. So we're going to get these cases. So a couple of scenarios. One would involve a situation where you say you simply cannot determine within reasonable medical probability the percentage caused by injury A and the percentage caused by injury B, and the examinee is going to get a single combined award. Okay? Well, what about a situation where you do provide, such as in the Benson case, you do provide a percentage of permanent impairment due to injury A and a certain percentage due to impairment B, injury B. And this almost happened in the Benson case too, by the way. This almost happened, where she had 50% of the permanent impairment due to injury A, the specific injury, and 50% of the impairment due to injury B, the cumulative trauma injury. What if the applicant asked you, doctor, what is the substantial medical evidence that supports a finding of permanent impairment due to the cumulative trauma injury? What is your support for opining 50% of the impairment due to the cumulative trauma injury? First of all, what's your substantial medical evidence for providing any apportionment to the cumulative trauma injury? And second of all, what's your substantial medical evidence for apportioning 50% due to the cumulative trauma injury? What if you're unable to support your opinion or your argument for 50% impairment due to the cumulative trauma injury? If the applicant attorney is successfully able to argue that down, or argue against the apportionment due to the cumulative trauma injury, or argue the percentage down to 0%, that would result in a single combined unapportioned award, which is substantially much greater than two smaller awards. So the applicant is motivated to claim cumulative and successive and simultaneous specific and cumulative trauma injuries under principles espoused in the Benson case. Basically, the applicant side is seeking a single combined award, and the defendant is going to argue for multiple separate and smaller awards. Okay? So I hope that sheds some light as to why it is that we're receiving so many claims for evaluations or requests for evaluations that involve these simultaneous injuries. And I shared with you two strategies by which the applicant can maneuver your opinion regarding two separate injuries into a conclusion for a single combined award. Okay, so that's the Benson case, and you may be asked specifically to provide a Benson analysis on those cases that involve two injuries that become permanent and stationary at the same time. Okay, well, let's talk about the other common scenario that we're going to see, or that we do see on a recurring basis, and that involves the examinee who has pre-existing conditions, either symptomatic conditions or asymptomatic conditions. And this is a fascinating topic. And it goes all the way back to the Escobedo case. If you remember Marlene Escobedo, she worked at Marshall's department store. She had pre-existing degenerative change in her knees. And the qualified medical evaluator, he apportioned like 50% of the permanent disability out due to pre-existing osteoarthritis of the knees. And Escobedo argued that the osteoarthritis in her knees was asymptomatic. She never had an ache, a pain, a restriction, any kind of limitations due to her knees. And yet the evaluator, he felt that that osteoarthritis was preventing her from getting well, prevented her from making a full recovery from an otherwise minimal mechanism of injury, and he opined that a large percentage of the permanent disability would be apportioned out. Okay? So pre-existing conditions can be apportioned out if, in your opinion, it contributes to the permanent disability. So let's talk about the Viara case. This is a case that involved the lumbar spine. Yeah, the lumbar spine. So Viara was a 73-year-old female who suffered 2 industrial injuries. The first was on August 2002, and the second was on January 2003. So these were separated by about 5 months. The agreed medical evaluator evaluated Viara on May 2005 for the second injury. Okay, it's not clear in the transcript of the case what was happening with the first injury, whether it was evaluated by another evaluator or whether the agreed medical evaluator for the second injury also evaluated the first injury at the same time. It's not clear. It's not clear. But nonetheless, 3 years, almost 3 years after the second injury, she was evaluated by the agreed medical evaluator. The agreed medical evaluator provided for 64% permanent disability. Okay? The work comp judge found overlapping disability of 10% from the first injury. Okay? Although it's not clear as to how this was arrived at, but what is known is that this injury resulted in 32% disability. So, although it's not clear in the transcript, she must have been evaluated by another evaluator who provided for 32% disability for this first injury. And with regards to the second injury, she was found to have 64% disability. And the workers' comp judge found that of the 64% disability, 10% of that could be apportioned out because it overlapped with the first injury. So this is a case where she had multiple prior industrial injuries, or at least one prior industrial injury. Okay? So keep these numbers in mind. She went from 64% permanent disability due to the second injury, minus 10% due to overlap from the first injury. So we're down to 54%. Okay? Okay. Then the workers' comp judge, he apportioned 40% of the resulting disability, which is 54%. Of the 54%, he said that 40% was due to pre-existing conditions. And the agreed medical evaluator described osteoporosis as a pre-existing condition. And osteoporosis, in his opinion, contributed to the permanent impairment in this case. And this case involves some compression fractures of the spine. So the evaluator opined that the osteoporosis contributed to the permanent disability. So 40% he apportioned to the osteoporosis. So 40% of the 54 resulted in 21.6% due to osteoporosis, and therefore 32.4%, which is 60% of the overall disability, was due to the industrial injury. Well, the applicant contested the apportionment to osteoporosis, but the AME clearly stated that the applicant would have had disability, due to the osteoporosis, that is, on the day of the industrial injury, even absent the industrial injury. Isn't that interesting? So the agreed medical evaluator considered that on the date of the industrial injury, due to the osteoporosis, that Viara would have had disability, limitations to activities of daily living, symptoms, positive objective findings, would have had some disability even had the industrial injury never occurred. That's interesting because Viara argued that the osteoporosis was asymptomatic. And don't we get this all the time? We get examinees who have asymptomatic, or they'll tell us that their conditions or that they were completely asymptomatic prior to the industrial injury. But if in your opinion you believe within reasonable medical probability that that pre-existing condition would have caused disability anyway, or in any form on the date of the industrial injury, you can apportion a percentage of the permanent impairment or permanent disability right on out of there due to the pre-existing condition. The court agreed that it was proper to apportion to the pre-existing asymptomatic condition. The only thing in this case that remained unresolved was the amount of the apportionment. It seems that the doctor did a poor job substantiating the 40% due to the osteoporosis. Why 40%? Why not 20%? Why not 10%? Why not 5%? So they challenged him on his percentage of the apportionment. The issue regarding the determination of overlap regarding the initial 10% was forfeited by the applicant. So the applicant was happy and did not contest the 10% reduction off of the total disability in the beginning. It was 64%. The workers' comp judge took 10% right away due to the first industrial injury due to overlapping disabilities, and the applicant did not contest that. So absent a contest or absent some objection, that was accepted. So very interesting. So what is the take-home message from these two cases? Well, with regards to the Benson case, we're going to get these cases all the time. I don't know about you, but it seems every single case that involves a represented worker that's coming across my desk now has both a claim for specific injury and a claim for cumulative trauma injury. And I'm sure that's the same with you. I know it is because I speak to doctors on a daily basis and they all tell me that this is what they're getting. Well, that's how you handle it. If you can reasonably, within reasonable medical probability, apportion the permanent impairment between the two injuries, then you've successfully done your job as required by Labor Code 4664. If you are able to provide for two permanent impairment ratings, be prepared for the applicant attorney to contest those findings and those opinions, and prepare for the applicant attorney to try and argue for a single combined award, perhaps by saying that substantial medical evidence does not support one or the other of your apportionment determinations, and arguing for a single combined award. Or you may determine that within reasonable medical probability, there's no way I can parcel out the percentage of impairment due to injury A and the percentage of impairment due to injury B, because to try to do so would simply involve surmise, guess, conjecture, speculation, what have you. And in that circumstance, the examinee again will receive a single combined and much larger award. Okay? So those scenarios can go one of several different ways, and you need to be aware of each of those and be prepared to handle each of those based upon the specific details of your case. The other case, the Viara case, deals with how to handle examinees who have pre-existing conditions, which is everybody. Everybody has a lot of stuff going on. whether it's an anomaly, whether it's a defect, it's a deformity, a prior impairment, a prior slip and fall injury, a prior surgery, whatever, pre-existing conditions. All of these things are simply lumped into the category of pre-existing conditions. If in your opinion, within reasonable medical probability, you believe that the examinee would have had disability due to those pre-existing conditions on the date of the industrial injury, you can apportion a certain percentage of the permanent impairment out due to those pre-existing conditions. And in the case of Viara, the qualified medical evaluator felt that 40%, a large portion, 40% of the overall permanent impairment or permanent disability was due to pre-existing osteoporosis in a 73-year-old female. And this was upheld by the judge. The apportionment to osteoporosis, pre-existing condition that was asymptomatic, was upheld by the judge. The only issue in contest was the 40%. And we don't know how that turned out, but we do know that apportionment was allowed for the pre-existing condition. And it's my opinion that the majority of cases that involve pre-existing conditions can reasonably be apportioned, because the pre-existing condition contributes to the permanent impairment in many ways. It prevents the examinee from making a recovery to a pre-injury condition. It compounds and complicates the medical treatment, thereby rendering the examinee recalcitrant or resistant to the effects of treatment. It generally causes a more severe injury than would otherwise be expected absent the pre-existing condition. So the pre-existing condition, in my opinion, most of the cases I've seen, reasonably contributes to the permanent impairment and can be apportioned out. And that's fair. That's fair. That leaves the employer responsible only for the portion of the permanent disability due to the direct result of the industrial injury. And in this way, apportioning in this way helps to accomplish the initial mission and goal of Senate Bill 899, which was to help control skyrocketing costs in workers' compensation. And in this case, we approach and address the skyrocketing costs, or the legislature addressed skyrocketing costs, through accurate and reasonable apportionment determinations, leaving the employer responsible only for the portion that they're liable for, which is the portion that's due to the industrial injury. They're happy to pay the portion that they're liable for, and they don't want to pay anymore. Neither would you, and that's fair. So doctors, hope this helps you. We've now covered several of the common scenarios that you're going to see over and over again. So you simply master these, and you'll have the apportionment determination whipped. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's session. I look forward to being with you in our very next session, where we continue our ongoing series entitled The Apportionment Black Belt. So for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.